So good afternoon, everyone, or good morning to JoJo, and good morning to anyone who's not in the Australian time zone. Welcome. My name is Michelle Maloney, and I'm the National Convener and one of the directors of the Australian AELA'S Alliance. Today's discussion is actually part of a month-long fiesta of Earth-centered governance discussions, webinars, and some remarkable conversations, actually. And I might put some links into the chat later just to remind people where you can find the recordings from the first 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks of AELA'S months. In fact, we're nearly finished because tomorrow is our last day. But before we begin and I introduce the rather fabulous JOJO MEHTA, as an Australian, I like to begin our discussions by acknowledging country. I live, work and play on the remarkable lands of the Jinnaburra and Kabi Kabi peoples, which is a very special part of southeast Queensland. So I'd like to acknowledge that all of the lands across Australia were never ceded by territory. There's a saying in Australia, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. And this entire continent was a connected patchwork quilt of bioregional governance. Since time immemorial, the first peoples of this continent have been caring for country and caring for each other. So it's very important to us that we acknowledge that. And we often invite folks in Zoom land, if you're in Australia, if you wanted to pop in the chat a quick hello and whose country you're on, where you're from, that would be lovely. The Australian AELA'S Alliance is a small not-for-profit organisation. We were formed almost a decade ago. We've been run by volunteers up until the last few years. And we've got a little team of 3 of us now with many, many volunteers who also connect with us. The purpose of AELA'S Month is for us to celebrate all of the amazing work that's going on around the world and around Australia, trying to connect more and more people to local places, trying to change systems, whether that's law or economics, place-based governance and beyond. So tonight we're very lucky to have JOJO MEHTA come and speak with us again. I often invite JOJO to give us a bit of an update about their work, advocating to see ecocide recognised as a crime. So that's probably enough from me. How are you? I was going to say this evening. You're this morning. How are you, JOJO?
I'm really well. Thank you so much for inviting me. And it's great to be back in this forum and to be able to give you something of an update. And obviously, I should also first start by saying where I'm from. Obviously, I mean, it's always an interesting dynamic, isn't it, with Australia? Because I'm so conscious that, of course, you know, it was the Brits who who did what they did and who are still potentially doing what they're doing in terms of the relationship with Aboriginal land. So I want to acknowledge that. And I want to say that I'm coming in from the Cotswolds, from the west of England. People always ask when I say I'm from the UK, they automatically assume I'm from London because that's what everybody from everywhere else in the world does. And I'm like, no, actually, I'm from the countryside. Yes, I live in a small market town in the west of England. It's called Stroud. It's actually getting a certain level of I wouldn't say notoriety because it's actually good. It's a bit of it's thought of as a bit of a green centre capital, I suppose, in its way in the UK. Not least, I mean, not we possibly contribute to that part way by it being where Stop Ecocide originated, but it's also where Extinction Rebellion was born, and it's also where the 2 biggest and first renewables companies in the UK also began. So it's got a particular vibe to it, I guess. And I didn't move here because of that. I actually grew up here. And I say that because when I came into about 10 years ago, when I moved back out of London, where I was living with my husband and kids, in order that, you know, I could reconnect with my home landscape, I didn't realize that actually that reconnection was going to feel really very profound. And in fact, that sense of, you know, obviously I was spending time with my young kids at the time, not quite knowing where my life was going to be taking me next. But one of the things that became very clear to me rather quickly was that whatever I was going to be doing, it was going to be deeply committed to this land as the land that I grew up in and that I actually feel like I belong to, which is something that I think certainly in the globally dominant Western paradigm, we are not particularly good at recognizing or feeling when we have a rootedness in a place. And I think it's a very, in a very human way, we protect what we love, and we love what we're connected with. And so that's in a way perhaps the biggest work that we all need to do, globally speaking. So it feels good to be in a context where it is both welcomed and necessary to make those observations. And I think that's very important. And actually, I literally just came in this morning, because right now it's just after 8 o'clock in the morning. I just came in from putting my bare feet in the garden, and feeling, reconnecting with that land, and kind of going, hello, I'm back home, having just spent 10 days in New York. And in fact, when we organized this particular appointment, it was partly because I would be able to come back with some tidings of what's been going on kind of on the world stage, but particularly in regard to ecocide law. I mean, I'm sure you're all familiar to some degree, at least, with the kind of concept and the drive of what we do at Stop Ecocide International. We're very much what we say in England, we're very much a one-trick pony, in the sense that we have one specific goal in the legal sphere, which is to criminalize mass harm to nature, or ecocide, as it is increasingly becoming referred to around the world. And our ultimate aim is to have that recognized at the international level, alongside genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and more recently, the crime of aggression. So in other words, at the International Criminal Court, that is our sort of main advocacy aim. However, of course, we also support developments that are happening around the world at the regional level and at the national level. And that what we are finding, and this is interesting and encouraging, is that where we perhaps previously thought that focus on national laws might distract from an international focus, in fact, what has been happening is far more like a sort of mutually reinforcing situation. And that is deeply encouraging. And so, I mean, I'll just literally kick off with just a few figures from recently. I mean, just in the last 3 months, there have been 5 ecocide law proposals put into parliaments in different parts of the world. So this whole conversation at national level is becoming very live. So those 5 countries are Brazil, Spain in the region of Catalonia, in a process which will ultimately reach the federal parliament, the Netherlands, Italy, and Mexico, not necessarily in that order. I actually just was in Rome a couple of weeks ago for the launch of the Italian bill. And of course, you may also have heard, because this is a longer standing situation, that Belgium has been moving forward also with ecocide legislation. They have now got past the various levels of government approval, which is fantastic. And it now goes to parliamentary approval before it's actually sort of adopted, if you like. And that's been an interesting process. And it will be the first country to move forward with a kind of, I suppose, an umbrella type definition that is in alignment with the international proposed definition that emerged in 2021. And again, perhaps worth just giving a very sort of brief kind of overview there, in the sense that this movement has grown, very, very rapidly in the last 3 years. And some people, obviously some areas of the world, have had this conversation going for a lot longer. And of course, Australia is one. And as you'll know, through the incredible work of Michelle and colleagues. So in some ways, I came to this story sort of partway through. But I would say there have been 3, I mean, obviously probably more, but I'll give 3 very, very significant milestones. One of them, tragically, was the passing of Polly Higgins, who was the most extraordinary legal pioneer and UK barrister with whom I co-founded what is now Stop Ecocide International. And we lost Polly in 2019 to a very rapid cancer, which is an absolute tragedy and a real shock, because nobody, least of all her, expected that to happen. But what I've come to realize, and particularly in recent months, actually, is that in a sense, she was really a martyr to this cause, because what happened when she left was a whole number of people got in touch campaigns, politicians, interest groups, lawyers, of course, from around the world saying this work can't die with Polly. What can we do to help? And so what our work has been a huge kind of exercise in dot joining since that moment. And so while, at the time there were various campaigns at different parts of the world, including, as I say, Australia, where this issue was, had already emerged, that Europe had already had a conversation as well. But this was kind of the beginnings of joining all of those voices up. Bringing it back onto the diplomatic stage was something that came from the Pacific. That came from Vanuatu, specifically the Republic of Vanuatu, one of the world's most climate vulnerable countries, who were the first to bring it back onto the diplomatic stage in 2019 at the International Criminal Court, and actually call for all member states of the International Criminal Court, those signatories to the Rome Statute, to consider adding ecocide as a fifth crime. And the third milestone, and this has been really the kind of massive accelerator, was the emergence of an international definition in 2021. And this was something that our foundation convened in response to political requests. And I think what's worth pointing out is that, of course, over the years, I mean, this term is around 50 years old, but over the years, various lawyers or small groups of lawyers had kind of worked on some definition of ecocide. Those definitions in a way had sort of continued to keep the conversation alive on the back burner, shall we say, at the political and legal level. And of course, Polly Higgins had her own definition, which we used as a campaign definition for a while. But when it comes to the conversation with governments, which this is ultimately a conversation, it is a conversation at that level, because if we want to shift the legal system internationally, governments do have to be on board with this. There needed to be a level of credibility and consensus around that. And that was what this international panel brought. And you may have come across the definition before, but as anyone who's heard me talk before will know, the concise core of it fits on the back of a business card. And this is brilliant, because when you're dealing with busy politicians, it's always very handy to have something they can take in very quickly, because often they're too busy to read a 20-page document. And so that definition is: ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. And it's worth just saying a couple of things about that, because we feel that they have the elements of this core definition are absolutely key to the uptake of this conversation around the world. And we can then I'm then going to go a little bit into what we feel the key advantages are of criminalizing ecocide, and then a little bit more about how this has been developing. So in terms of how this is described and defined, there are kind of two elements which are there are a number, but I'm going to highlight two elements. One is that this is not a crime or draft of a crime that lists a number of acts. When we look at environmental law around the world, for in the vast majority of environmental regulation is very precise and very detailed and very context specific. For example, this level of a certain toxin may be used in this circumstance up to this point. Those kinds of rules, if you like. And so those who are in the position of being potential perpetrators of serious harm to nature, on the whole, tend to approach environmental regulation in this way, and also, obviously put their lawyers and their due diligence people into this kind of arena with this in mind. In other words, what they're sort of saying is, how much can, what can we get away with in a way, before we cross these red lines. Now, this definition doesn't do that, and it doesn't do it for a number of reasons. But what it does is it brings the whole concept of the crime into the area of consequences. And rather than saying thou shalt not do X, Y, or Z, what it says is whatever you do, it should not create this severe level of harm. And what that does is it kind of creates a sort of container, if you like, or a sort of foundational piece that is missing at the moment in environmental law, because it means that, you know, wherever those gaps are, wherever those sort of ways of avoiding, you know, falling under existing law come in, you know, this is a piece that can come in underneath and say, well, look, you know, actually have those boards of directors sit up and think, well, you know, if we don't complete our due diligence and our environmental obligations in the right way, and we're threatening ecocide as a result, well, suddenly we're actually looking at the possibility of having a tap on the shoulder and finding ourselves in criminal law territory. And obviously that is a huge you know, a huge shift, if you like, in the attitude that the corporate world has to this, and indeed policymakers. So that's very important. And I think there's also, you know, this way that it also creates a kind of dynamism, a level of being future-proof, because of course we don't know from one year to the next what ecocidal nonsense someone is going to dream up and, you know, try and legitimize. And, you know, there are some sort of directions that are already kind of, and I'm going to use one of the fossil fuel metaphors because most of British English is full of these, unfortunately, just like military metaphors. But there, you know, there are things in the pipeline, like, for example, deep sea mining, which potentially would, you know, might not have been, you know, not existed even in this category some time ago, and may become so. And so it's very important, we feel, to have and thankfully the panel of lawyers who drafted this had some very interesting discussions around this and concluded really in the arena that I'm talking now. In other words, that it was important to approach this from a consequence perspective. And the other advantage of that, of course, again, when you're dealing with politicians and governments, as we do at the sort of core level of this, at the diplomatic and political level, it's actually quite useful not to be finger pointing specifically at particular companies or at particular sectors that various different governments may or may not have connections with, and simply to make it effectively a very clear and also a very moral argument. So that's very important. And the other aspect that I'll highlight is the other threshold that's in this definition. So acts that, you know, will become ecocide under this definition need to be unlawful or wanton. And this is really interesting because I remember thinking, along with some of the more sort of activist lawyers in that panel, and there was a more conservative voices and more sort of people's lawyers, if you like, in that group, was thinking, well, hang on a minute, surely we should be condemning any act that comes into this category. And you know, there's a level on which that is true, and a number of the, you know, when people have effectively objected to this definition, it's often been on those grounds that it's not strong enough because it includes this second threshold of acts must be unlawful or wanton. But what is very interesting about this, I did have a kind of a eureka moment myself, a sort of aha moment, when listening to this debate going on in the panel that I was convening, and it was really this. At the diplomatic level, nobody wants to feel like they're having their toes trodden on when you want to move something forward at the political level. If we'd have tried to emerge from that process with something that said, no matter what you've got in your laws at the moment, this is now criminal, as in we are creating a new crime that's going to cut across all of that law, that would have been very, very difficult to move politically. So that's one aspect, is that it effectively it meshes in with existing law. Not only that, but what's been really interesting in the period since is that we have realized that actually there's, you know, a large section of the acts that are in fact ecocidal are already within that definition. But I think the other thing that's really important about it is that it does it does bring in a level of dynamism again.
If you'd like, I can try and answer the question that was posed in the chat.
Yeah, Lyndon, introduce yourself. so people know who you are.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name's Lyndon Devantier. I'm one of the co-leads for the Stop Ecocide campaign here across the ditch in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So I kind of have a handle on this. Oh, Jojo's back. Thanks.
Sorry about that. Our internet literally just dropped out for a moment. Can you hear me again?
Yes, we can, love. You froze. I was just trying to.
Where did I get to?
I'm just trying to remember. You haven't been gone long. You've only froze about 2 minutes ago. Lyndon and I were about to have a chat in case we were going to have to kill time to see if you were reappearing.
Going to come back. Yeah, I think I was talking about the unlawful aspect. Was that right?
Yeah, unlawful and wanton. I think you were about to say, because people often critique it. Why is this? And don't forget also, please do explain to folks what the definition is. It's not a legal thing yet. It's just a recommended definition for what ecocide is. And Jojo was talking about the fact that this definition says crimes of this nature that are already unlawful and wanton. So maybe just pick it up from unlawful again.
Okay, yeah. So my apologies for the tech issues. The unlawful or wanton threshold is important because it allows the crime to mesh in with existing law, and it effectively means it's not cutting across existing law but adding to it. And my understanding of that is that this is actually rather important for everyone that is working on improving existing law in very specific areas, because as of course law improves in any given area, this definition will also improve. So it effectively allows for the definition to become more powerful over time, and at the same time to avoid political issues with the idea of cutting across existing governmental provisions. So while I completely sympathize with those who say, look, we should simply criminalize everything that caused that level of harm, having that aspect allows for the discussion to move forward, but it also includes this level of wanton, which means that even if you have, or willful, it's a little bit in a similar category, that if you have something that is effectively permitted but creates disproportionate harm, it can still be caught by this definition. As Michelle says, this is not a definition that is currently in place at the international level, but what it has done, and the reason that I spend a few minutes talking about this, is that it has absolutely opened up the conversation at the international level. I mean, put it this way, from a personal perspective, before the emergence of this definition, I was still able to read all the emails in my inbox. Effectively, that has not been the case. It's in a very sort of colloquial phrase, kind of gone bananas since then, in the sense that the political discussion, the legal discussion has expanded and multiplied to a huge degree in the last 2 years since that definition emerged. And what is also important is that where we see the domestic proposals being put into parliaments, we are seeing a very strong coherence with this international proposed definition. Sometimes it's almost literally word for word, which is what happened in Mexico. The Brazilian one is also very, very close. We see that it's kind of based on that same on those same principles, which is the case in Belgium. So, all of those countries that are moving forward are recognizing that the principles that have emerged in this definition are very important for the for the kind of coherence, if you like, and for this whole concept to land in the political world. And of course, there are kind of, I guess, three main areas, some of which I've talked about, that we feel like are absolutely key to why this is important. And I'd also like to link the ecocide law sort of initiative, if you like, with the rights of nature and the broader Earth laws movement, because they're quite, they're very, very complementary. We feel that the ecocide law is a very specific and precise step, if you like, in the kind of evolution and use and taking up of laws that take the living world into account. As you will all know, I mean, there are rights of nature judgments that have taken place in, now, Michelle, you'll correct me, but I think it's well over 30 jurisdictions now, in terms of recognizing particular aspects of particular landscape features and so on. And when I was in New York just last week, I took part in a number of conversations where the rights of nature movement and developments are really coming, they're really kind of visible above the parapet now at the kind of UN level in a way that has not been the case up until now. I mean, I went to a remarkable event in the UN around ocean rights, for example, that had a really, really big audience and range of speakers. And, just seeing that emerging at the international level is hugely, hugely encouraging. I also took part in a panel with various sort of key voices from the rights of nature movement, like Cormac Cullinan, like Natty Green, like Professor Garavito, a number of names that those of you in the arena will have heard of. And it's bringing in, for us, it's bringing in this complementary piece that kind of it feels like just the other side of the same coin in a way, which is that the criminal law aspect has this complementary relationship with rights of nature. I mean, I often illustrate this in a very sort of simple way, which is to say that obviously, our basic human right is the right to life, and that right is protected by the fact that taking away that life is a crime. In other words, murder is a crime. And so you have this kind of complementarity here that I believe is very much illustrated in the environmental sphere with the relationship between ecocide law and rights of nature. So effectively, you have the criminal law sphere as a sort of protective layer that enables the kind of power and support of the rights sphere to have that additional foundation. And of course that now applies within the human rights sphere as well, with the UN's acknowledgement over the last year, that acknowledgement of the UN right to the universal right to a clean, safe and healthy environment. And so again, we have this kind of complementarity here. But I will also kind of put a little bit of a sequencing sense in there, in the sense that there are lots of acknowledgements of rights of nature and rights of particular landscapes around the world. But the whole shift that I believe we are all wanting to see in the one, it's where we shift from, the protecting people and protecting property to protecting the living world upon which we all depend. And of course, the rights of nature movement and a lot of the whole kind of arena of earth law is ultimately moving in that direction. And that is super important. And it's actually ultimately, it is the fundamental shift that needs to happen. And we feel that, ecocide doesn't do that in and of itself, but what it does is it kind of creates a sort of bridging piece, because what we're doing, I mean, on one level, I like to think of it as almost acupunctural, kind of very precise, inserting one crime into a list of crimes that are already there. It's a sort of achievable thing within the current system. It doesn't sort of require people to, completely shift their entire perception of the system, which is ultimately what we're wanting to do. But what it does alongside destruction of people, what it's doing and what it's saying is actually quite profound, of course. What it's saying is that it is just as bad, just as wrong, just as dangerous to destroy the living ecosystems as it is to destroy people. And that in a sense, I mean, certainly in my mind, creates a kind of a sort of preparatory ground, if you like, within the criminal side of the legal system, which is very, very important in this overall direction. And of course, there's the sort of fundamental aspect that criminal law is often, I wouldn't say misunderstood, but it tends to be focused, people tend to focus on the fact that it's about punishment, and that it's about, and obviously that's incredibly important in terms of the functionality of it. But what is really interesting to see is that that's where often the lawyers and the politicians go first. How will this, work in practice? Who will be in the dock, etc. And of course, what we're really looking for with criminal law is deterrence and prevention. Murder is a crime to stop people killing each other. We want ecocide to be a crime in order to prevent people from destroying the environment and destroying the living world. So So there's that aspect that is hugely important, and the sort of beginnings of the creation of that moral imperative. So yeah, I mean, that's obviously a fairly broad picture, but to come back more sort of immediate updates, one of the things that was very encouraging in New York was that we had, I mean, we took part in a number of events in terms of, bringing the subject of ecocide law into a number of different events, including some quite high level ones like the Global Futures Conference, which was put together by Johan Rockstrom and Peter Schlosser, and that was very high level speakers. And actually, I didn't realize until after the panel I was in that the moderator of the panel was actually Obama's sister. I had no idea until afterwards. And that was with I was having a fantastic conversation with the former president of Mauritius. I also attended, I mean, it's one of those crazy weeks where, you can go to an event where, almost every panel is made up of kind of ministers and all of that kind of thing. So, great to actually have the conversation being able to be inserted into those arenas, very useful. Also the possibility, because New York Climate Week is coincident with the high level week at the UN General Assembly, it is the 1 week of the year where there is representation from every country in the world in that one city, because of course all the countries have permanent missions in New York, and so there are heads of government and ministers all in one place, and that's obviously one of the key advantages of having a presence there. And we did, although I can't go into huge detail because it's behind closed doors meetings, but we did have held a diplomatic meeting there, and you'll be pleased to know that there were at least 11 states there for most of that conversation. It's a conversation that is certainly picking up momentum, at the diplomatic level. Not all states are ready to talk about this publicly, but there are many engaging in the conversation, and we're now at a stage where even the sort of public introduction conversation at parliament or government level around the world is
okay. Lyndon, do you want to very quickly fill in the gap and chat about the question you were going to answer, and then we'll see if poor Jojo can join us again. I think the main question is about well, actually, it's probably worth clarifying two things. So what Jojo has been talking about is the move to try to get the law of ecocide recognized at the international level. And one of the ways, not the only way, but one of the ways is trying to get it included in the Rome Statute, which is an existing structure inside international law. She also talked about national ecocide laws, and the questions, really there's been two at the moment about, so who gets in trouble, or how does this law work? Someone was asking, do you take the corporation to court, or is it just the CEO? And the other question was bigger, wasn't it? It's do businesses and corporations get in trouble with this law, or is it just governments, or is it not governments at all? So Lyndon, just quickly while we see if Jojo can join us. Oh, she's back again. Hang on, Jojo. I think we'll just let Lyndon answer this question and then we'll come back. So,
yeah, sure. Well, the corporate veil has been an issue with the soft law approaches. This is where the ICC has a much stronger remit, really, because it removes the corporate veil and the government veil. So people will be well aware that former government leaders have been held to account at the ICC. And so it's not targeting corporations; it's targeting the leaders, the decision makers. So that kind of is a very quick answer to that question.
Thank you, Lyndon. Sorry, Jojo, I don't know what's happening. I don't know if it's at your end. It doesn't seem.
It is. Sadly, it is at my end. It does. I have no idea why it's happening, but I'm obviously going to be having words with our provider, but it's dropping me out. So my apologies. But actually, I think it would probably be great to kind of move into more interactive sort of situation anyway. So I mean, obviously I've sort of done a bit of a broad overview, a little bit of an update from New York, but yes, I'm really, really delighted to just kind of engage in more kind of to and fro, because I'm sure people have got particular questions, or I mean, let's just explore, shall we?
Yeah, thank you. And Danelle's also said, if you're having trouble, Jojo, you could always turn your video off, and we'll just be very happy to hear your lovely voice. But no, let's have a couple of questions. So there were two questions that we were chatting about, that I was chatting about with Lyndon, and it really is from the international law point of view. If the law is put into, if the draft ecocide definition is turned into an actual, provision of the Rome Statute and becomes international law, who is going to be the kinds of groups or people who can be accused of ecocide? And Lyndon started to talk about that answer. Did you want to talk about the practicalities, firstly at the international level, and maybe reflect on what these new national laws are trying to do in other countries?
Yeah, absolutely. So with the International Criminal Court, it's intended to be a complementary court, or a court of last resort. So it's supposed to be effectively, if a national government, if a national jurisdiction, and if the courts can't or won't prosecute, then potentially it will go to the International Criminal Court. And the focus is on individuals, as I think Lyndon was saying, as I pop back on there. He was talking about policymakers and decision makers, but of course those can be corporate decision makers. There is nothing in the Rome Statute that says it has to be government members. So, but it does focus on individuals. So it is looking at those who are in the sort of positions of superior responsibility. The way of seeing that very clearly is, for example, if you look at genocide, it's not the foot soldiers who will be prosecuted at the ICC, it's the controlling minds. So that's the idea. And we feel it's actually quite important, although the ICC doesn't deal with corporations and doesn't deal with governments, it deals with individuals, that at the level of deterrence, this is actually very important, because I think, as Linda might have been saying, there's if you prosecute a corporation, and I'm not saying there isn't merit in doing that, there is, but effectively those people, it is people who make decisions, and those people are not easily reachable in that way, and they can potentially just wander off and take their nice bonus and either go and get another job or continue in their in the same vein. And so the idea of creating a level of concentration of the mind where somebody might be, hopefully not, they haven't got that far, but they're sort of poising with their their pen over the dotted line, thinking, well, am I going to become liable for ecocide? That is part of the point of that. But I would also add that what ecocide as a crime can do is something that we would suggest is less easy to do with the existing international crimes. So, for example, if you're a war criminal or a, God forbid, genocidal maniac, the likelihood of your own jurisdiction prosecuting you is minuscule. And so, the likelihood is that the sequence will be that you will end up somewhere else or in the International Criminal Court. Now, I think with ecocide, there is actually quite a lot of potential for that court to sit where it's supposed to. In other words, as a complementary court, because a lot of ecocidal activity is corporate activity. Those who might end up in a position of, having that tap on the shoulder, could potentially be prosecuted anywhere where the crime is ratified. Obviously, if universal jurisdiction is not applied, then they would have to have some link to the jurisdiction where they're being prosecuted, whether that's where they come from, whether their corporation has an office there, whether, it's where the ecocide itself is happening. There are a number of different ways that could be linked. But what it means is that, cases can, and I would suggest will be taken in a number of different national jurisdictions. And this is where we, link with the national developments, because there is a kind of mutually reinforcing sort of direction of travel that is emerging here, because obviously the more national governments acknowledge that severe long-term and widespread harm to nature is a serious level crime, the more that will sort of gather support at the international level, and conversely the more real it makes it for perpetrators, because there are actually national jurisdictions where those prosecutions can be taken. And that is ultimately where we imagine most prosecutions would be taken. And because the International Criminal Court cannot deal with, just let's be frank, would not be able to deal with the number of potential ecocide cases that could be on, you know, in the landscape. But as that, as an international crime is ratified, and as and this is actually happening sooner, not that we necessarily expected this, as domestic jurisdictions adopt this, you know, we're actually seeing a kind of reality check starting to happen, I think, in people's minds, that is very healthy, and one that I believe, as I say, will interact well with the original intended role of the ICC. And it's worth saying that the ICC itself, the court and the court's sort of administration, are both very aware and, on the whole, we feel supportive of this movement towards criminalizing ecocide. In reality, of course, the court's administrators have zero impact on whether this actually becomes a crime or not. It is totally down to the state's parties. But
can we return to that?
Yeah.
Can you perhaps give a quick reminder how many nation states would be required to introduce it as an amendment or an addition to the Rome Statute? So how many nation states are needed to support making ecocide a crime in international law?
Absolutely. So there are 123 member states at the moment, or signatory states to the Rome Statute, or I should say states that have ratified. And so those all form members of the Assembly of States Parties, which is the body that decides what happens with the Rome Statute. And 2/3 are required for an actual adoption of an amendment. Now, in fact, the way the ICC works is mostly by consensus, which on one level could seem daunting, because they prefer not to push something to a vote. But the very fact that they prefer not to is actually quite interesting, because what it means is that as the conversation emerges, the voices that are strongly in favor, and if there are any voices that are strongly against, will be the ones that become visible. And therefore it'll be, we feel it will actually help in terms of where the conversation needs to be focused, because what it isn't is a sort of tick box exercise, in the sense that it's more about having a sort of strong coalition that are interested in moving this forward, and effectively reassuring and allaying any fears of those who are specifically resistant. It's a bit of a situation where you could say that sort of silence gives assent, if you like. And that's not necessarily a bad position to be in from the perspective of negotiating a text on a new crime. And of course, with the membership of the ICC, it's like the UN. It's a one state, one vote situation, which means that those smaller states, and often it is those smaller states that are interested in this. For example, the small island developing states, as they're known at the UN, although I think we like to call them Great Ocean states, because for obvious reasons, certainly the Pacific and Caribbean can actually have a huge influence here. And that's really important. And unlike the UN, there isn't a Security Council and there isn't a veto. So, it really is, on that level, it is a numbers game. If it does get pushed to a vote, it is a numbers game. So it would be, yes, indeed, 82 countries.
Yeah, someone's just on the quick math. So
yes, I can see
82 countries sounds about right, Danella. So, and I know from past experience that, as you say, the small island states in the Pacific and other places who are in dire trouble due to climate change and sea level rise are very supportive of bringing ecocide in as a law. Do you have any, I mean, we're not expecting you to tell us numbers, but do you have a feel for the kinds of support that other countries, or how many countries might be already on board to try to move this further?
I think at this stage, it's more about who's engaging in the conversation, because realistically, I mean, sometimes people say this, how many countries have you got signed up? Countries don't do that. They don't kind of sign up, years in advance of something being put through. They talk about it. They, the conversation gets louder. There are various sort of positive noises or whatever. Obviously, a country that's legislated for it could be said to be in favor of it. But there are plenty of other countries as well who are talking about this, who probably wouldn't say right now, yes, we're definitely going to support this. But as with many treaties, until the treaty's actually on the table, we don't know exactly who's going to come in on board with that. So we tend to approach it from a perspective of how many people are talking about it, how many people are engaging, how many governments are engaging in the conversation, either in public or behind the scenes. And we would say that number now is probably between 30 and 40 countries. And obviously there are different levels of engagement. Some are further ahead than others. Some are very publicly either supporting or dealing with it in their parliaments. But there are actually many more which are engaging in the conversation. And I'm not always at liberty to say who exactly those are. But yeah, it's certainly, it's gone from really a non-existent conversation 5 years ago to one that at sort of political and government level is very much a live diplomatic conversation. So it's certainly, it's very encouraging.
It is encouraging. Thanks, Jojo. I'm aware we've only got about 10 minutes left. Do you think we could dig a little deeper into some examples of if the law was operational, if it became a crime under the ICC system? Could you give us an example of the scale or size or extent of something that would probably be seen as ecocide, and what that would mean at the international level, or, at the, say it is a director or of a corporation, but what would it then mean for countries who are members of the ICC but don't have ecocide law, like Australia maybe?
Well, I have to say that Australia has become a little easier to deal with than it was in terms of politically speaking. But actually, an Australian example, and you'll note I didn't say a lot easier, but certainly but certainly, I have to say the example that immediately springs to mind was the one of the mining company destroying the sacred site, the Aboriginal sacred site. Relatively recently, actually, wasn't it? But that's exactly the kind of thing that could fall under this definition, and not least because there is this element within the definition of culture, sites of cultural significance. And I think this is really important. And in terms of extent and scope, there are different ways of looking at that. So this would be one where effectively the cultural resources are destroyed along with the living environment. And that is, so that could be an ecocide level crime. But also you could be looking at the destruction of a complete, thank you. I don't always remember the names. I just saw in the chat. But you could also be looking at the destruction of a complete ecosystem, of a whole ecosystem. So you could be looking at, what's happening with the Great Barrier Reef. You could be looking at a particular species even. So that, although that could be geographically quite concentrated, it could be quite, significant in terms of what is being removed, damaged, what is being affected in terms of the wider web of life, if you like. So widespread's actually been sort of defined as both something that covers a whole geographical area that goes beyond just, you could be looking at a whole river system, for example. Or you could be looking at something that goes across boundaries, but you could also be looking at some of these more precise things like the destruction of a cultural site or the destruction of a particular species. So I think there are various sort of ways in which this could come into play. And people often ask for specific examples. Now, if I was, going to respond from the lawyerly perspective, often the lawyers will slightly avoid this because there isn't a final text in place. It can be, they would say, well, it will depend on the facts of the case at the time, in the same way as if, someone beats you up on the street, it's not the number of bruises that tells you whether it's grievous bodily harm or attempted murder. That will come from the surrounding circumstances in a given case. So, there will be aspects of this which are in criminal law will have to be addressed. But what I will say is that this is not aiming to be a silver bullet for all environmental damage. On one level, it's like, well, wouldn't that be lovely? But actually, that's not the point. Actually, there are a number of, a huge number of protective laws in place that are simply badly followed and badly enforced. And the same goes for multilateral environmental agreements. If we were to follow the Paris Agreement, if we were to follow the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework in its entirety, we would probably be living in a very different world right now. But that isn't the case. And so this is a kind of a support for all of those laws rather than addressing all of those things. But we would say, for example, I would say that there are kind of even in the industrial accidents, that even in a context where an act has to be deliberate, I think would still come under those that arena. For example, I mean, Deepwater Horizon, where we know there were safety protocols that were not followed. Even Fukushima, where we know that there were design protocols that were consciously not followed, and that could have made the fundamental difference as to whether that disaster occurred or not. So one of the big things here as well is, again, it brings in that deterrence, but also that precautionary side, where a deliberate decision to not engage safety protocols, or to to go ahead with one design in comparison to another for cost reasons, if you have a criminal law aspect that is saying, if this leads to an ecocide, this could be a prosecution, then you're looking at a very different sort of range of criteria for agreeing those projects.
And then if such a law exists and such activities take place, would it be a case of several directors in a company? Would it be, because the emphasis is on an individual? I have to admit, I've forgotten. Could it also be, can someone under the ICC, could an individual inside a government agency, like a minister, who's made the approval? Because often the corporations are doing stuff that's already been approved by the government. Not always, but most of the time. Could one individual in government be prosecuted under an ecocide law internationally?
Theoretically, yes. I mean, they would. I mean, you would have to show that effectively, I suppose. I mean, under the proposed international definition, you'd have to show that there was a level of recklessness there. In other words, that decision maker knew that decision was, in the normal course of events, would actually lead to this level of destruction. At which point, that could potentially apply. I mean, we could see, for example, perhaps further into the future, one could see the agreement to open a new coal mine, or to go into new fossil fuel extraction projects could even fall under this definition. We think, I have to say, that the likelihood is that any early cases would probably not be those kinds of things. They'd probably be much more likely to be a direct pollution event, because of course there are lots of lawyers wanting to get their teeth into this as an actual potential prosecution situation. And they're going to want the jurisprudence to work, and for to be clear, and to build in the right way. So the likelihood is that early cases would be very kind of obvious direct pollution cases. That's the likelihood. But the reality is that when you look at that definition, that could apply. I mean, we're looking in the UK at an agreement that's literally just come out yesterday for a new drilling project. Who knows? I mean, 10 years from now, that could simply be unacceptable in terms of this law. So we don't. That's kind of an evolving place, if you like. But
For sure. And I think these examples are just to help people get their head around how it practically might work. Someone's just mentioned that, in fact, there has been another, and I apologize, I've been so busy with Earth Wars Month, I didn't know. Donnell says that this week, Namaldi cultural site was wrecked by Rio Tinto in Western Australia. So, oh my goodness, I shan't swear on screen, but that's not a lovely thing at all. Jean has asked, I'd be interested to hear corporate activities themselves can be banned as ecocidal by their very nature, like coal mining, for example, and deep sea mining. Do you think there would ever be a time when at an international level, or even a national ecocide law, they would say, no, these activities are not going to be permitted because they will commit ecocide? I mean, that's the whole deterrent point, isn't it?
Yeah. Gosh, sorry, I just saw that message. Rio Tinto said sorry. Oh my God. I mean, I think, as I say, I think it's quite important that ecocide per se is not defined as particular activities, because then people have a tendency to kind of sidestep and say, well, we're not doing that, we're doing something a little bit different. I mean, we had an example in the UK where the government redefined what the word fracking meant in order for it not to fall into certain categories of, problematic categories. This happened in 2015. So, those things are, a kind of problematic. Legally speaking, I think we need to have ecocide defined as something that is consequence based. I mean, my feeling is that is one of the reasons it's been taken up in many areas because of that. That doesn't mean that there won't be things that will effectively intuitively fall under that category, and therefore decisions in those directions will have to be very carefully thought about. I mean, one could look at I mean, there are some things that kind of fall a bit in potentially in between. I mean, for example, personally, I would consider, you know, the building of a nuclear power station to ultimately be potentially ecocidal. The actual building of the power station itself may not be. I mean, in fact, the actual building of a nuclear weapon may not be ecocidal, but the use of it, I mean, there's no way you can avoid it being ecocidal. So, you know, there are kind of, you know, areas where what you might see is that the civil use of certain things, like, say, nuclear power, what you could end up with is a situation where if it's still undertaken, it will be undertaken in with a very different attitude to safety, for example. So you're, you know, I mean, I don't know. I mean, yeah, I can totally see Michelle's expression on that. I'm with you.
Yeah, is there such a thing as a safe nuclear plant? But anyway.
Well,
yeah,
exactly. But the brilliant thing about this is it will throw up those questions. It will absolutely throw up those questions. So that, for example, is it in fact safe? You know, ultimately, this is about safety. This is actually about safety of people and planet, you know, of our entire web of life. So it's really a question of, I mean, and as with all criminal law, that's what this is about, is what keeps us safe. So what we very much believe it will do is throw up exactly these conversations around, can this actually be done safely? And are there alternatives that we should be using? And so in that way, it's also a strong support to, you know, cleaner forms of energy. And of course, here, I think this is a really interesting issue as well, is looking at the transition side of things and being and acknowledging that actually a law like this is absolutely imperative if we are not going to jump from the fossil fuel frying pan into the cobalt and lithium fire, for example, you know, in the sense that those transition minerals are often located in very fragile and climate regulating ecosystems like rainforests and so on, and deep sea and all of these things. And therefore, you know, we can't just jump from one to the other and say, well, this is great, we're now engaged in renewables, but we're actually just destroying another section of the environment, and, you know, more living ecosystems, and more of the living world, in order to satisfy the same extractive mentality, but just in a different area. So for me, this is one of the key aspects, actually, of ecocide law, is that there has to be some kind of outer boundary safety rail in place for whatever direction we move in. Otherwise, we are going to simply see replacement of one extractive project with another kind of extractive project.
Yeah, we've been exploring that recently with degrowth and new economy discussions around green extractivism. So yeah, it's a valid point. Yeah. Jojo, I'm aware of the time. We've come up to our hour, and I'm sure you've got a very, very busy day ahead of you. If not, hopefully you've got a day of napping to get over your jet lag of coming back from the US. But thank you so much for joining us and being such a voice of, I guess, persistent optimism too, for the power of what these laws can do. And it's also very exciting to hear about all these other countries who are starting to bring ecocide into their own national jurisdictions. Is there information about those national laws on the Stop Ecocide International website? Or,
yes, I would thoroughly recommend. I mean, the most exciting page on our website is the breaking news page. So if you go to the news and events menu and go to the breaking news page, it's almost like, I mean, it's the closest thing we've got to a journal of these developments.
Yeah.
And when you go to the specific ones, it links to the government proposals and so on, so that you can see what those are. And it is really very exciting. I mean, every time I go on the page, I go, oh my God, I can't believe there's so many pieces. And we're not even completely up to date with with all of the. I still have a little list of at least half a dozen kind of, perhaps not national level, but other developments that need to go on there. So yeah, I know
the feeling, Jojo. We were reflecting today that back when I started working on rights of nature issues, there were two examples in the world: the Ecuadorian Constitution and a national Bolivian law. And then after 2017 in the New Zealand examples, it exploded. And then I was called a veteran the other day of earth laws, which I thought was kind of cool. But then you kind of just sit back and watch the momentum, and it's really awesome. So well done for you and everybody involved and anyone on this call. Lyndon, thank you so much for being our go-to conversationalist while the web internet dropped us out. But yeah, thank you so much, Jojo. It's terrific to have this update, and we appreciate your time.
Oh, such a pleasure, always a pleasure. And let's keep up the work. I mean, it's it's just so important, and it does feel timely. It does feel that there is a shift beginning to happen, and let's just accelerate it as much as we can.
Absolutely. And we'll speak to you again, no doubt, in a few months when we cheerfully bring you back in to tell us what else has been going on around the ecocide world. So
brilliant. Thank you so
JoJo.
much.
Yeah.
Take care.
Thank
Have
you,
a great
everybody.
evening.
Yeah, we'll see you soon. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.